Shirley, please introduce yourself and share with us what is it that you do?
Okay. My name is Sheryle Baker, and I've been a psychotherapist, a licensed mental health counselor since 1984, I believe, and have been director of the Life Center here since 1981. So this has been my career. This has been a community that I've been part of, a stewardess or a guide in helping grow up this amazing place called the Life Center. And what we do here is really helping people through the deepest losses of life. Generally, generally it's situations of sudden death, of situations where people have been traumatized by a loss due to an injury or hit and run situation, and people that have been assaulted. And so there are types of situations that we see on the news, and then it's the aftermath of how people cope with that and how they find the resilience within to go through it. And that's a journey of grief. And my work is really, as I've always thought, to being a midwife in that process, because there is death, there is after a death occurs, and there is that ability to how do I re-normalize my life and grow from this experience.
Now, I hear you, and I know what you do because I follow some of your career, but also because some of my students have done their practicum and internship here, and also because I contributed some hours in the past.
Yes, you did.
But the question I always have in my mind is, how do you find the stamina, the capacity to work with some of the most painful experiences? What helped you be a midwife, as you describe it, while listening to sometimes what people will describe as horror stories, or major losses, or life crises? How do you do it?
Well, I think sometimes it's important to know it from an inside experience. And I had that inside experience as a young teenager. My brother died suddenly of a rare bone disease. And that set my life in motion for my mom to really question everything about her loss of her son, and also what is life, what is death, what happens after. And that set her on an exploration, and she ended up at the University of Chicago and met Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in about 1970. And part of her healing was through the grief, through the loss that she experienced, and how it helped her, I think, to go from what was the leftovers from my brother's loss to helping other children, and to, in that process, she was able to find her way and to give back in the universe. And in that experience, that was a mentor to me, my own mom, but it was also Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who is the psychiatrist at the time in Death and Dying in the World, and she would take people that were in terminal stage of dying and be able to have them be the teachers to the students, to the interns and medical residents at the University of Chicago, and have them tell their story and what it's like and what their needs are and what was important to them when a professional caregiver came into their space. And that was a very amazing thing at the time. And she did it sometimes with a mirror screen and sometimes in an audience with 500 residents and interns from the university who really got a firsthand of what it was like from a person's living and dying experience. So for me, I was exposed to that at a very young age, and it kind of really colored and emphasized what was life about, and also that death can occur at any time. My brother was 13, and what am I going to do with my life? And I was lucky enough to have a mentor like Kubler-Ross, who kind of said, you have to give this back to the universe in some way. And you have a sibling perspective, and it's not everybody's perspective, but it's an important one that there are a lot of people that need to hear what it was like for you struggling through this, going on to school, having a life, and seeing the depression work its way through my own parents, and each one dealing with it differently. So I think that those were the preconditions that set in motion that I had that even capacity to go to school and to have a career when I didn't really know what I wanted to do at 19 or 20 years old. And the more I involved myself in that and really went with her all over the country to different transition life death workshops, I saw an opportunity for that intuitive part of myself to come through and to use it as to value it, because she valued it in me, and I'm going, I just see and understand and learn certain things, and I'm very primitive with it, so I need to really get the base and groundwork. But there was this coaxing in me or coaching in me that she was able to help me know that there was something inside that was a contribution to people in the counseling field.
And how did you go from there? Because you were very young, and you were exposed to traveling and with one of the leading figures on death and dying, and sharing your personal experience. And so, what happens afterward?
Well, I think it was a couple of years of that. I was also working at a children's hospital in Chicago, and I was working with a lot of chronically ill and kids that were on dialysis, kids with sickle cell anemia at that point, and lupus. And my way was to kind of go in the side door, and a friend of mine taught me to play guitar and do folk singing, and that was my joy in life. And it was that opportunity to teach kids who were hospitalized and bedridden, and to teach them a few chords. And they could write their own songs, they could do Beatles songs, they could have any number of opportunities to, while they're in bed and they're captured. And in those days we didn't have smartphones and computers to entertain ourselves with as young folks were. And so it was my way of teaching something that kids that really wanted to do it, it was a bonding, and it was a way that I earned their trust, and that ability also gave me the possibility to do some casework, also do some opportunities for counseling. Even though I wasn't a counselor at the time, I was with the kids at the late night shift. I was with them when their parents left. And that's a lot of the time when Elizabeth used to say the cleaning lady comes in and she gets the lowdown when the counselor gets the surface value. So it was a way that the music was a catalyst for bonding. And that was just the beginning of that story. And I traveled with her, and then at some point she wanted me to do lectures at the University of Chicago, and I was 22 or 23 years old and really pretty green, and all I had was anecdotal stories and pictures. And I learned to share the art with people, and it was her symbolic language, her nonverbal symbolic language of what children tell us through art, through music, but it was the art that they could just show what they knew, sometimes way beyond their years. And often that ageless wisdom came through for little kids that really didn't know what was going on, but they were drawing pictures of tanks that were imposing upon them, or coffins, or being killed, or whatever. And some of them were in remission at the time, and then some of them relapsed. But the pictures kind of were a map of their world. And I learned to trust that, and I took some other work and courses in art therapy. Elizabeth brought in a psychologist by the name of Greg Firth, who wrote a book on interpretation of children's drawings in dying situation. And he did a lot of training with us. So that was another piece of that side way in without talk, without the verbiage that we think we're supposed to come with and know it all. And, it was like to just be a kind of with beginner's mind is how I walked in the door of counseling. And then I later got, training and graduate work and did some Gestalt Institute work here in Tampa in the 1980s, and really was able to learn from that point that we're more than the sum of our parts.
We're talking about your work as a gestaltist, providing workshops on Gestalt, and that's when you actually came to Tampa.
I was in Tampa, and I started volunteering at the University of South Florida when it was the medical clinics and before Moffitt Cancer Center. And so I was working in the hematology oncology department as a caseworker. I wasn't a social worker, and I was on my way to get graduate degree, but I hadn't at that point graduated. So that was my job in a way, and I really worked with children that were dealing with so many aspects of leukemia, lymphoma, and again, it was learning from them that kind of experience of what serious illness, and then learning that they had short time for lifespan for their lives, and what was important to them, and how I worked then with the parents as well. Because again, I was there in the late hours and not just at the times when the doctors and the nurses were with them, but watching the kids interact who were very ill with each other and the care and compassion that they showed each other. And my place was just to get out of the way, in a way, and I was there a couple of years. And at 1983, I guess it was, that I started working here at the Life Center.
And what was the Life Center at the time? Was it starting, or was it an established place? Help me.
It was really Marty Cohen, a psychologist that's still in the clinical area in Tampa. And he and another psychologist, Dr. Marilyn Gatlin, really formed the center based on a couple of children from All Children's Hospital and their families who were dealing with cancer. And so in that beginning, in an old little house in Hyde Park, they would get pizza and get the kids together in a separate room. There'd be another facilitator with the parents or the grandparents, and then there'd be a different group for the siblings, because it was to help that kind of experience in a family systems, that you couldn't just work with the child that was very sick. That was one piece of it, but the family was having their own struggles. And sometimes it was financial, sometimes it was just having the money to pay for treatment, and all of those things that go with it. So I worked at the Children's Center, and then the Life Center came along, and I think one of the founders kind of said, we really need someone to direct this. And that was a point in my life, another transition point, and they said, you can do this. And I said, really? And I'd never been a director of any place. So, just starting it out, there was a big desk and there were pencils and a piece of paper, and people would call and ask for Marilyn Gatlin, and they'd go, well, who are you? So it was really to carve my way, to make my way. I did a lot of presentations to different organizations, to women's centers, to crisis centers, to hospices, to schools, a lot that I still do these days, to really talk about nonverbal symbolic language of children dealing with death and dying, to talk about what grief is like and different stages that Kubler-Ross presents. And those stages still hold some water. Some people really criticize them, but that sense of when you first have a deep tragic loss or a major change in your life, there is that first shock that you go through, that denial. For some people, not everyone, there's anger. There's diffuse anger sometimes at the world, at God, or at one person, or the hospital where the death occurred. And then there is sometimes bargaining that if only, and a lot of the situations I went from working with chronically ill children and sometimes acutely ill children to working with adults that were dealing with a lot of sudden death. And in sudden death, there isn't that time to say goodbye. There's a lot of unfinished business, and there's always this sense, very often, I won't say always, but mostly this sense of if only, or I should have, or I could have, or how come I didn't know this, and that always looking for the missing piece of the puzzle that I could symbolically bring back to make it change. And I think that that's that struggle that people go through in grief, letting go of the attachment to what was. And that's a process, and for some people it's a lifetime process. For other people it might take a couple of years or a couple of months, and I look at it as it's timeless, that every person is unique, and that their grief and the feelings and their attachment and relationship all take its own course in kind of revising and adjusting to the physical loss. And then what is that essence of the person that you always want to remember? And that leads people into exploration of life after death, where there's no particular proof of that. But a lot of people have experiences, and over these 30 years I've listened to a lot of folks that are very practical, very professional people that will say to me, I've had an experience of my loved one, and I'm always interested in that. And it doesn't take away from the grieving process. It's actually a part of it, and it's the kind of bridge, in a way, to honoring that loved one goes on some way in your heart and your being, whether you have dreams of them or you have some kinetic experience or energy experience of them. I really get that there's a lot more to physical reality or to this life that we live. And it's not a particular philosophy of mine, but just to know I live with that mystery and look at there's more. And wouldn't that be nice that it may be so? But none of us will know till we die. So I really listen to those stories of near-death experiences, of people that have had experiences of feeling their loved one, or getting a message from their loved one, or a sign of something they needed to hear and an answer. And to me, it's just being present to that. To have judgment, to me, is a turning off of just the pureness of that relationship and the ability to listen to people without a lot of filter. And I think that that's a deep part of what I offer as a counselor. It's about our presence, and it's about listening in a way that it becomes a real exchange and not just a superficial one.
Help me understand that when you say about presence and listening, that implies like a real exchange. Sounds paradoxical that you will be present and allowing the person to share his or her story, and yet it will be an interchange, an exchange between you and the client. Mm-hmm. Help me understand that.
Well, I don't know how measurable it is, but it's an energy. It's an energy exchange, because when people get that I'm really listening to them, the questions that I bring up, just like you, as your professor part of you, are an interactive dialogue. And it's not just asking a flat question and getting a yes or no answer. But the questions that I find come in that way are explorative, are let's see, how would I say that? That it's more of an exploration of what's going on inside that allows a person, when they trust the exchange, to really let their feelings come out. And also it has that ability and opportunity for that aha moment. And to me, I don't go for it or look at it as a goal, but it occurs a lot when I'm present and I'm not thinking, oh, I want to get them to go here and I want them to move in this direction and they're over here somewhere and I've lost them. So the learning comes from those kinds of experiences as well, that then when we're in sync in a way, that's an energy exchange. It's a nonverbal exchange. I'm watching body language. I'm experiencing an intuitive, maybe questioning of a statement that they made, but not in a judgmental way. I'm very careful about that because that can really turn people off or become defensive. And if they do, I know that I'm off track. It's not their responsibility, it's mine. So that's kind of what I mean by having that dialogue, having an exchange, and at the same time not having to absorb their stuff. Because if I dive into their pool and their drama and their pain, I'm not being able to be fully present. And I'll start feeling tightness in my body and fidgety or bored or I'm yawning more. Those are all my signs that I'm not paying attention. And when I'm in sync, I'm not tired. I'm not in any sense of time. It's timeless. And I think we have lots of those kind of experiences. Maslow talks about that also. And it goes from that physical basic needs to what's really going on, and that you're that important as a client that I want to know that, and I want to help to be with you with it, and that takes trust. And that comes with experience. When I was a newbie, it was a lot of, oh, I want to get them to do this, and I got to be able to ask the right questions, and what if they really go off on a tangent? How do I bring them back? Nowadays it's really when we have people even in a group or individual and they get off on tangents, it's like I can go, how does that relate to your grief right now or your feelings right now? To help bring it back, but not in a way that cuts people off.
So it's a very intentional listening, but it's also a focused listening in that you get out of the way but remain as a companion.
Mm-hmm. Kind of a midwife in their process.
Right.
Because a midwife isn't doing the birthing, right? You're on the sidelines, you're giving a little coaching guidance, and then you're letting the natural process occur. And there may not be a baby as a result physically, but you have some aha. If you do, that's an extra bonus.
You mentioned, I hear you, and you mentioned the aha. What would you say, or how would you explain the aha for a person who is working on a loss? Because you can imagine, I can think about the aha moment when I'm thinking about finding a solution to an issue or creating something, and I have this light bulb going up and you go, yeah, I got it. But when you are processing loss or trauma, how is that aha like?
Okay, good question. It may start in the cognitive processing, and then it's about going to look at where are the emotions stored, and at the same time, what are the interpretations, what are the beliefs that people make about themselves regarding the loss, the death of their loved one. So that aha moment may be what I might think is, well, it's no big deal, but the aha moment comes from the client. And it comes from the client going, I didn't think of it that way. Or I've been interpreting it as my fault, or we had an argument and then he died, And if I didn't have that argument, equals my fault, that equals death of my father or whatever it is. And to be able to take them outside of their own limited, I would say, perspective, and to be able to just help them find that solution. So they may find a solution, or they just may find, oh, I really don't have to go down this path. I think I'm going to take this road and see what happens. And so sometimes it's an emotional release. It can be a cathartic experience that just they haven't cried in 20 months or 20 years sometimes. And they find that they're surprised themselves because that emotion has been buried and stored and not allowed or not able to come out. I mean, it's any which way. A lot of people say, I was never taught it was okay to cry. I was never taught that it was okay to speak about my sibling or my dad ever again. And they carried that for 30 years or 40 years. And they're now middle-aged or older, and they're going, it was survival at that time, and now it doesn't apply. And when they can have that, that becomes an aha moment, that I can give myself a different sense of okay or permission. And I'm doing it as long as I, as the counselor, help create the safety in the environment, I get out of the way. Does that answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because I always think about as a student of counseling and a student of psychology or any other mental health professional. I'm sorry. You wonder. Okay, so how do you explain to others what is it that happens on a grieving process, for example? And part of that is letting the person get connected with whatever is in the person and finding sort of what got stuck or what has been holding them or what have they been holding in, and get to touch it in some way and to explore it in some way, and sort of like even learning to embrace it and let it go in a sense, or sometimes embrace it and keep it but with a different sense.
Mm-hmm.
I remember a person that I work with that has eliminated any memories of her daughter who died, when she was an adolescent. And for 20-something years, it was just as if her daughter never existed.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden there was this sadness that she couldn't explain. And her anger, and of course she was angry at herself, at her husband, who was also being part of, let's wipe this out, let's not talk about
Sure.
it, and then reconnect. And it was truly sort of like a recapturing of the daughter that she had lost. Although, obviously, the daughter wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
But that was not important. What
Doesn't
was
matter how many years go by either.
And so, as you were explaining, I thought that was an aha moment for a person who came in with descriptions of depression and anger, and no mentioning of the daughter.
Wow.
It was just a symptomatology. I've been sad. I don't know why,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm upset about pretty much everybody and everything.
Yeah.
And it turns out to be that it was connected to this early loss that she have not spoken about for 20-something years.
And that's post-trauma reactions, whether we call it PTSD, whether, it's just that it's insulated and it's not okay. And so a lot of life gets really thwarted. It really gets narrowed. The focus of life is, well, I can only do this, but if this comes up, I got to hide this, or I've got to kind of take care of my pain through other substances or other life experiences. But if it isn't okay, then there's a piece of my life missing. But I think some people will not realize that until many, many years later, if that.
Very true. Very
Yeah.
true. Now, so in all these years, you have helped many, many different people, and sometimes when we spoke, I learned about very violent situations. A person who was assaulted at the front door of her own home, for example, and part of her tooth were knocked out, and yet the person survived and rebuilt somehow. So, how, when you go down to memory lane, how is that type of reminiscence? Are there particular cases, without, of course, going into a
Of course.
specific, but that you remember as particularly salient in your professional career?
Well, they're all intense trauma experiences, and it's the person's ability to kind of go through that in their way and to detach from the suffering of the last moments. And I think, in some of the skill set I use, which is, I know you use also, is eye movement desensitization, are ways to help decode that stuck place, or the way that a parent is holding on to the life of their child who died by that, I want to say T-1, before the trauma, the last breath that was taken, that suffering the parent takes on or the loved one takes on. And so in accompanying that as a counselor, it's trying to also help them detach in a way, not from the love of their child, but from the tragic moment. And when they can see, and again, an aha moment can occur, when they can see or feel or taste or touch in a way that their child only was suffering for a moment or 5 minutes or that day, which is horrible to think about, but when they can say that their child finished that suffering and they've been carrying it on psychically in their being and somatically often in their being through illnesses, there's that shift that can occur. And eye movement desensitization, cognitive therapies, different ways, somatic emotional release, different ways that we can work through the body as well as the cognitive process, shift can occur at that place. So those are some of the ways that I see that healing shift, even from the murders. And one family I think about, and it was a horrible tragedy of their child, their 20-some-year-old daughter being murdered and raped before she was murdered, and things that you hear on the news. And this has taken years for those families to process. There was a lot of separating that went on in the family, some divorce that went on because the parents could grieve differently. They couldn't come together in their grief, and that just set them further and further apart. So those are some of the things that that any tragedy sets in motion all kinds of other losses all around it. And then you're dealing with how other siblings are handling that. Some kids are getting on drugs after the fact that their brother was killed. Maybe they felt some piece of that they could have prevented it. You don't know those things right away, but you see how people hide their pain. And those are the losses all around the main loss. Sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's just emotional, that mental health issues really come out when they've been very dormant and nobody would have even noticed. But some people, it's about, bipolar situations that are rageful, or just a lot of rage that you'll see in road rage, where people never did that before, or kids are stealing and they've never had a background of this. They raised in a very family that had not a financial issue. They were not economically or mentally deprived of anything. They had good parenting. However, that attention and that need to express their hatred of what happened and their hatred of the world in that moment and God and all of the snowball effect occurs. So a counselor is dealing with the family system as well sometime. And sometimes I will have the family come in if they're willing, and that's if they're willing. Sometimes a family session sets off all kinds of other igniting of little firecrackers, and we'll go, maybe some of this can be better addressed individually, and we can still meet as a group, but to explore and not judge the way one person's grief differs from another. So there's many situations I've seen, and I'm also still struck in all of these years with the resilience of the human being to get through from victim sometimes to survivor, and then sometimes to even thriving. The ability to go on to have another child, to have a new relationship when they have been grieving their spouse, their partner. It amazes me, and I'll get an invitation to a wedding or a bar mitzvah or a christening, and you just go, life goes on, even when you think it can't happen. So I've been struck by the resiliency, and I work with that. I look for the places of the person's strength, and I look to how we could invite that. To say, what were your coping abilities before this loss? What were your supports? What got you through? What about your beliefs? What about your religious or spiritual community? Some people have that, some people don't have that. And some people, there's nothing after death, and that's the way it is, and we'll explore, that nothingness. And other people, I have to know that my loved one goes on in some way. And to me, all of that is part of the healing. It doesn't have to increase a fantasy, but sometimes it's a way of balancing that essence of the person is that relationship doesn't die. If you're a parent, you're always a parent. So I think those are some of the ways that I've really learned, because to me, many years ago, Jerry Jampolsky was a psychiatrist that wrote a little book called Teach Only Love, and Love is Letting Go of Fear, and that there are two main emotions in this world. We think there are many more, but two main are love and fear, and we have choices, as to which way we go. So that for me is just always encouraging, and seeing what the strengths are in people and helping them build on that, and exploring, the negative aspects of what religion used to mean to them, and it doesn't hold any weight anymore. And they may come around, but it's not my job to push that in any direction. It's just to go, that's another loss. You were a member of a church or a synagogue for all of these years, and right now you cannot go back. Okay, that's where you are. What is the missing of that familiar, and what do we have to support now? How is that support a different support? And we look for ways to help people gain that. And sometimes it's in support groups here at the Life Center. Sometimes if it's a bereaved parent, there are other community groups. And sometimes people will say, oh, it's just too much pain. I can't deal with anybody else's pain. I've just got to hold on to mine. And hold on to mine is sometimes the key way that they say, I'm not ready to give this up. I'm not ready to let go of my attachment to the suffering, because in some way many families or people will equate that with that I'm forgetting them. And I think that that's a key piece that as counselors we can bring in that psychoeducation on. It's not about forgetting them. It's letting go of that piece of time that caused this. And we can process that all you want, but do you always have to carry this around in your head? And can we use certain techniques when people give me that permission? I'll use some EMDR or some ways to say, where are you holding this in your body? And sometimes just that question will bring up an emotional kind of either reckoning or a release or some way that they're going, oh, my stomach has been so tight for years. And they'll equate that to the breath that they took and tightened everything in their body, and they've never been able to relax into it. So there's many different ways, but I love that now we're bringing mindfulness into the counseling field. I love that we have wonderful ways to non-verbally work with somatic release with people and body work that kind of in our cells we kind of can make shifts and experience changes that affect our physical. You know, when you deal with those emotional stresses, it's helpful.
When you do that process, by the way, do you also focus on a specific part of the body and ask the person to get in touch with it or to get the message, or how do you?
Sure. Sometimes it's just saying when you feel the anger and you tell me how you expressed it. What's the precursor to it? What are the beginning warning signs that your heart starts to race, or you feel antsy, or you feel trapped and restless and you got to move and you got to pace and you move your feet and your body kinetically, just to get them to pay attention, to be aware of that is an opening. And then the part would be have them say when you feel that kind of anger and you can connect right now to a scene in which it appeared. We don't have to get the body fully going, but where did you feel it? Where do you feel it when you think about it now? And sometimes people will actually say, oh, it's up here, or it's in my throat, and I can't talk, and it's choking up, or it's in my heart. I start to feel I can't breathe well, I'm shaky. Those are those components. So we can work with just the symptoms. And some of the ways in EMDR, and there's also accelerated resolution therapy that I've sometimes used and been trained with also, that is just working with the symptom until there's some shift. And we'll do that with bilateral stimulation, tapping that's a bilateral way of just getting the person to kind of bring up both hemispheres of the nervous system. So it's not just the amygdala part, that's that fight or flight thing, but you're teaching them skills to kind of awareness in the beginning of it that maybe they can modify or moderate the effect. And sometimes anxiety, there are just some tapping points, that emotional freedom tapping or things that I've learned along the way, simple little things on the side of this is the heart line. And so you could just tap on this 50 times and see what happens. And some people will say, I'm in a panic, I'm on the road, and you'll go, okay, pull over if you ever have that again, and just try some tapping and see what happens. Many people will say, it surprised me. It kind of calmed me down a couple of notches. Or deep breathing. And sometimes I'll teach a counting breath, which is Dr. Andrew Weil's way of just giving a certain counting number to the inhale. The same count number, if it's 3 counts in, you're holding for 3 counts, and you're doubling the exhale out the mouth. Simple techniques, but 90% of the people here, when they learn it, will practice it both in a stressful time, and I ask them to practice it early on when it's neutral. And they can just get the breath going because it's a little awkward. Most of us don't think about our breathing, we just breathe. But it's a way of having them come back to the present moment. They can't be in the past or the future when they're counting their breath. Those are some of the ways. Easy, but we forget. Sometimes we think, oh, it's got to be really complex and how are we going to deal with it? And yeah, there can be real complex things that come up in counseling. but I also see that sometimes the most success are these teeny little places where people can take control when they're not in the counseling session.
Very good. Now, you mentioned early on that when you were working with children with chronic conditions, that even though they were in that situation, they did have choices. What do you mean by that?
Oh, the choices sometimes would be some of the things that they either could control in their lives when a lot of things were out of their control and adults and medical people and procedures were happening which were very frightful. Sometimes the kids would get together and they would have their own kind of secret codes or places that they, programs on the TV or things that they could laugh at. And laughter is great medicine. Making fun of some of the nurses or the people on the staff, any way that they felt that they could, because some of the situations I do remember where kids were very chronically ill and parents had other children to take care of. These kids, when they were in the hospital for long periods of time, and I'm talking months with dialysis or lupus, they got neglected. And what I mean by that is the parents just didn't visit. So their family became family of the medical staff or the social service worker or the art therapist or the person that kind of, they got to say, oh, I can talk about how bad it feels, you know, and sometimes it was just a very simple thing like holding a teddy bear or ways that they could feel of value even when their parents were lessening the visits. You know, some of us as staff didn't understand the why, but it was also as the child was getting sicker and sicker and potentially becoming terminally ill, parents were having difficulty visiting. And it made it harder because there wasn't the same hope. And so we looked for what are the ways that kids could control it. And in those days you could get them a turtle, a pet turtle, or it was before pet therapy, which is now at major hospitals, but things that would help them give choices even in their diet, even in the ways that they had visit with a special kid in a different room. Little things, very small things. Sometimes it was in the art that they drew to say, you know, what really mattered to them and how they did know a lot about what was happening deep inside their bodies, even when it wasn't showing up on medical tests. And sometimes the doctors really would ask me, what was that picture about? And I said, well, you have to ask the child what it's about, because I can give you some interpretation, but it's really their interpretation and what they feel overwhelmed by. Blood tests, all the icky things that happen when you're, in a hospital setting.
I understand. Now, you also mentioned the idea of working with the strength. Finding the strength on a person, again, whether it's a child or an adult, who are going through major losses, for them to think about strength is like
It's
difficult.
Hard.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's hard, and it's not always an easy thing, but sometimes I have found that people who have helped each other, either through their community or their religious setting, or they end up volunteering while they're in the middle of grief, but they're volunteering in an animal shelter. Or they're able to just help another person. And I kind of bring that back to how my mom got through abysmal depression and pain. And in those days, it wasn't about taking an antidepressant for her. And she found meaning of being able to feel like you were still alive by volunteering. And she volunteered with children on a leukemia floor, which a lot of us would say was, oh, that's a terrible thing to do. For her, it was right. And she told me, she said that was a major component of being able to just get up and out of bed, because of structure helped her find that strength in herself to give that love to another child.
I see. Now, what advice would you have for an upcoming counselor who would like to actually work with either children or adults with chronic illnesses, or with persons who have gone through major losses, or with persons who have been heavily traumatized by accidents, assaults, violence? What would you suggest to them?
What comes to me right away is do your own work. And everything else, it is work on oneself in getting into the counseling process and doing some of the interpersonal, not just didactic, but the interpersonal kind of support groups with each other and peers to learn about yourself well before you're going to counsel other people. Because so many people go into the field, and I did, in that way, because I felt like, okay, I had an experience, and who was it that helped me? I had a wonderful psychiatrist in the world to kind of point some ways with me and catch me on my vulnerabilities and call me on things that were very hard. I was pretty fragile at that age, and but I was challenged by it, and it brought up my creative juices, and it said, yeah, I want to do this as a thesis. And she even signed off on it. So I have Kubler-Ross on the bottom of my graduate paper. But I think to do your own inner life work first or along the way, because else it leads into working with people. It causes that compassion fatigue pretty early on. And I've seen people that are still deeply embedded in their own their own family issues, their own dysfunctional family stuff, or the victim aspect of their life, that can bring that into counseling, which then is muddy with the client, but it also still carries on that victim experience, and it's not fair to the process or the counselor itself. Sometimes you can't help it, but often when I have graduate students here, I ask them to keep a journal as they're listening to me, sitting here with the client, or what happens in their process. Not so much what they see is important, what they heard is important, and I always include them in as an extra pair of eyes and ears because I might miss things, and it's been helpful. But it's more important that what they're taking home with them in that day, and what are the leftovers, and what it's bringing up in them. And people have really responded very well when they go, wow, I went home, I wrote out some things, and I realized I still have grief from the loss of my person 5 years ago, 12 years ago, whatever, and I didn't realize it till now. So for them, it's an aha moment, in that way. So I think if you get out of your own way and you're not bringing that baggage into the counseling experience, you have a lot more success rate, because people pick it up, and people pick it up in me or in anyone when I'm not clearly being with them and inviting them to be more exposed and to be more fragile, vulnerable in the process of counseling. And if they can't trust me, then they need another counselor, or they're not going to go back for counseling. And sometimes the biggest compliment comes from when people say, well, I've had other counselors and you're different. And I ask, what does that mean? And they'll say, well, you listen to me and I don't feel the judgment. And I think those are two important components, because if we bring our own judgments into it, it's muddy, and the person doesn't feel safe. And that's a main piece of it too, that you create a safe environment if you're going to be in the field. And then reaping the rewards are people get better or they don't get better, but you've done your part.
Very true. Now, so you have the privilege to work with Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. How was the relationship with her? I mean, at a personal level, what What was your perception of her?
Yeah, well, sometimes it was like Mother Superior. Sometimes it was this amazing psychiatrist that was such an artist, and in a room of 50 or 100 or 500 people, she could call forth some of the very important learning to people and help them remember some of their untapped potential and also unfinished business. So that was her creative artistry, and I watched it very carefully. I observed, and I didn't ever have the feeling that I could be that kind of therapist. But there was a part of her that was very compassionate and saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, and nourished it. And she was very Germanic, Swiss Protestant, Germanic, and sometimes very demanding. So when I was introducing her on stage at USF many years ago, it was one of the last lectures she did in her life before she had a major stroke. She was just fit to be tied. She wanted to smoke a cigarette in the back of the non-smoking behind the curtain at the USF, not the Sundome, but the events center, special events center. And I'm going, oh my God, I'm going to introduce this person and talk about her compassion and her non-judgmentalness, and right now I just like to wring her neck. And so we had that kind of thing going sometimes, but it was like a family member at times, and it was just a very difficult at times, demanding at times, but I really had a lot that I needed to learn from her. And so I also had to learn to stand up for myself. She was a superstar, but sometimes she could be off also, and sometimes she would really ask what was my perception of what happened, and began to help me trust my own intuitive perception and ability.
Very good. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
I don't think so. I think I've blabbed on enough. Just that it's certainly been a very rewarding career in so many ways, and we'll see what happens in the future, but I'm glad I grew up this amazing center called the Life Center, and the ability to see so many people move forward from some of the deepest pain of life that they can handle. And for me to be part of that process on the sidelines and never get too attached to the end goal, because we never know. Some people get what they need and leave. Some people don't get what they need, and I never hear from them again. And then 10 years later, they'll see me at a restaurant and say, oh, you helped me, and I never knew. So I think it's just about letting go of the goal of what we're going to accomplish. And yes, we have to have treatment goals, and yes, we have to comply for insurance purposes and professional, ethics. But I think it's so important that we learn from the clients in that way.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.